Welcome to Zerothreetwo Conversations, the podcast where we talk to creatives, see how they live, and how they do their work. I'm your host, Carlo Villarica. Alright, this episode is going to be a little different. Instead of the usual episode where we interview a creative, I wanted to try something different and talk about a specific topic. And in this case, considering the last episode with Isa Please, where she mentioned that, she doesn't think that a lot of people know about podcasts. And I have to agree, ever since we started 032 Conversations, I've had to explain to people what a podcast is. So I thought I would have an episode and just talk about podcasting in general from a listener's point of view. So, first of all, what is a podcast? A podcast is basically audio that you can download or stream from the internet, right? And then in this case, it's a show about talking to creatives. And you can just put it on your phone, stream it, download it. And like how I like to listen to podcasts is I use an app on my phone and then I subscribe to certain shows. And what happens is when that show or when there's a new episode of that show, the app automatically downloads it into my phone. So, well, first of all, just to give you an idea, why did I start listening to podcasts? Like 3 or 4 years ago, as many of you have experienced and continue to experience until now, like we spend a lot of time in our cars stuck in traffic. There was a time when I used to be, I don't spend that much time in the car anymore because I bike, but that's a topic for another podcast. But back then, I would spend a few hours a day in my car, just stuck in traffic. And then I would get so bored. I would end up listening to the same music over and over. And frankly, I did not like listening to radio. Radio is not a good experience for me. So I wanted to try something different. What other thing could I do at the same time while I was driving? And then somehow, I guess people or something in the internet mentioned podcasts. So I looked into it. That's how I first downloaded my first podcast. That's why I first downloaded my first podcast. I think it was like the Nerdist podcast or something. So I would have something to do or something to learn or something to listen to while stuck in my car driving. So it really did feel like, and honestly, whenever I do drive, it continues to feel like a big waste of time. So what did I use to download the podcast? I use an app called Pocket Casts. Pocket Casts on your iPhone. There is a podcast app where you can use for free. Pocket Cast is the Android version that you can use to download podcasts and subscribe to shows. I'm sure there are a lot of other options now, but back then there weren't many for Android, so I ended up paying $1 or $2 for it, and then honestly, it's been my most used app in my phone. So very well worth the few dollars that I paid. But there are many other options. Like I heard a friend of mine uses Beyond Pod, and I'm sure if you just search for like free podcast app Android, there are many options. Yeah, so that's the app I use. So typically I like podcasts because I don't have to think about it. I just subscribe to certain shows. I wake up the next day and see which shows have new episodes, and those are what I listen to. So it's kind of like TV in a sense where you don't need to think too much about what you're watching or in this case listening to. You just set it up and then it just works. So that's what I like. In fact, I had a conversation with my friend and then he heard that I launched a podcast and he asked me about it. And I told him, yeah, I listen to podcasts because I get stuck on the road and I got so bored. And then I asked him, so what do you do when you're on the road? So he actually would turn up YouTube. He likes basketball. So he'd turn up YouTube. I forgot exactly who he was listening to, but he would stream that YouTube episode on his phone. He wouldn't look at it while driving or anything, but that's what he would listen to. Then I was like, why don't you just try searching his name in this podcast app and see if he's there? And sure enough, he was there. And I saw him a few weeks later, and he was like, "Yeah, bye." I started listening to Bill Simmons and a slew of other basketball-related podcasts, and then that has made his commute, much more bearable. So, as far as I'm concerned, there are two types of podcasts, at least the popular ones. So, there's a type of podcast which is very similar format to mine, where you have interviewer and an interviewee, and it's basically a conversation, right? It's very easy to do. You just get in front of a person and you hit record. The other type is a super produced journalism, storytelling type podcast. My favorite version of it is this podcast called This American Life, and they tell stories, audio stories, in a way that is super produced, beautiful stories. And it's like somebody telling you a campfire story, but on steroids, in a way that there's background music, there's a real climax to the story. It's very well done. Some of the best storytelling in the world is done by This American Life. And there's a whole bunch of other podcasts that do the same, which I can get into because in 2016, I actually wrote an article for rogue.ph. Let's load that article up. It was called No Radio, No Problem 10 Podcasts That Deserve Your Attention. And, I was just asked to list 10 podcasts that I was listening to at the time that I thought was fun to feature. I'll just read a few choice listens from the rogue.ph article. First podcast is WTF with Mark Maron. The nice thing with him is he gets to interview so many like well-known people as well as comedians. He's a comedian himself. He notably interviewed President Obama, Will Ferrell, Keith Richards, Lorne Michaels. He's one of the first people to set up a podcast. And the second thing on the list is This American Life. I already mentioned that earlier. Another show that I listen to until now is the Tim Ferriss Show. In terms of learning new things, in terms of trying to get better as a person, the Tim Ferriss Show is one of the best shows that you can listen to. It's very varied in its subject matter. He's interviewed famous people like Jamie Foxx, Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he's also interviewed like marketers like Seth Godin and even athletes slash photographers like Jimmy Chin. You should check Jimmy Chin out. And they talk about what's his tagline. His tagline is like, let me check for his tagline. Oh yeah, his tagline is deconstructs world-class performers from eclectic areas. He doesn't say that in his podcast though. To extract the tactics, tools, and routines you can use as the listener. In terms of trying to make your life better, the Tim Ferriss Show is one of the best that you can listen to. I'm about to finish one. He's interviewing like a monk, talks about compassion and everything. That's like a huge departure from his previous shows. All right, next on the list is Planet Money. This is a fun little podcast. How they would describe it would be like, imagine you could call up a friend and say, meet me at the bar and tell me what's going on with the economy. Now imagine that's actually a fun evening. That's what we're going for at Planet Money. That's Planet Money. Another show on the list is the Bill Simmons podcast. If you like pop culture, NBA, Bill Simmons is a podcast to listen to. Bill Simmons, back when I was in college, used to write a column too, and I think his style and way of writing really influenced how I like to write. And eventually that's kind of what I'm trying to go for with 032. Not writing about the NBA or anything, but just that style. Another next on the list is Reply All. Reply All is a show all about the internet. Anything weird about the internet, Reply All has it. Like this is one of the best shows that I've listened to, and you should really get into it. If you like the internet, like weird stuff on the internet, you should listen to this. Next one is Nerdist. I haven't listened to the Nerdist so much anymore, but it's the podcast that got me into listening to podcasts. It's hosted by Chris Hardwick, and it's just like listening to it's the style of interview that they do in the Nerdist. I try to emulate in 032 Conversations, when it's just like you sat down in the middle of a conversation between two people. Of course, the difference is his conversations include stars with Tom Cruise, Quentin Tarantino, Daniel Radcliffe, but we're not trying to compare anything. Another podcast that you should try getting into, especially if you want to get into business or trying to start some sort of a startup. This is a podcast called Startup. Particularly, you should listen to season 1. Season 1 is one of the best podcasts. Season 1 of Startup is one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. It's about the journey of Alex Bloomberg, formerly of This American Life and Planet Money, as he starts his business. He ends up calling his business Gimlet, and today Gimlet is one of the biggest podcast companies in the world. So, Startup Season 1 goes through his journey about how he started that company. It's fun because he has awkward conversations with billionaire venture capitalists, talks about the uncertain future, his uncertain future with his wife, and even like awkward conversations with his business partner. It's really a good listen. And I can't mention podcasts without talking about season 1 of Serial. It's at the time in 2016, it was the most listened. It probably still might even be the most listened podcast of all time. The first season followed the real life story of Adnan Syed and took a look at the circumstances involved when he allegedly killed his ex-girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. You need to start at the beginning, season 1, Serial. You won't be disappointed. Other podcasts that didn't make the Rogue.ph list, because that list was written like 2 years ago. I've listened to a few more podcasts since then. So just try to run through it. So there's Heavyweight. It's very difficult to describe exactly what Heavyweight is about. In fact, in the website, it just says Jonathan Goldstein goes back to the moment everything changed. But let me explain a little bit of what happened. My favorite episode of Heavyweight. It's called Gregor. So Jonathan Goldstein has a friend. His name's Gregor. And Gregor's long lost friend is Moby. Moby, the famous singer. Anyway, so Gregor lent Moby his collection of Alan Lomax CDs, which Moby never returned, which Moby used to create the album called Play. That album launched Moby's career. So like in the CD Play, Moby has a lot of music he remakes a lot of music from Alan Lomax. Super good episode and super awkward and such a fun listen. One or two more podcasts that I'm listening that may not be on the list. One podcast that you should try to get into is Hardcore History, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. If you like listening to like 2 or 3 hour podcasts where a guy talks about what happened in the past in a really, really interesting way, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. In fact, my favorite series is when he talked about the Genghis Khan's, the Mongolians, the Mongols. I got to read up a little bit, but it was so interesting that it compelled me to download an audiobook about that era, and such a fun listen, especially if you want to look back in history. And he has like episodes about World War I, World War II, about so many other things. So a good listen all around. And something I should mention also is another podcast called Radio Lab, similar in vein to This American Life, but they also do like journalistic, super produced stories, but also really well done. Kind of a different style, but still up there in terms of quality, in terms of storytelling. So those are some of the podcasts that I like listening to, and some of my favorite ones. In fact, which podcast had the most impact, direct impact to my life? I would probably say the Tim Ferriss one, just because like he's interviewed so many interesting people who really do share how they can change your life in a better way. So the Tim Ferriss one is a good one. But you can find a podcast just about anything. A few days ago, I was trying to research for like local podcasts, and I found a podcast called "In the Car After," and the the concept is it's like I think this guy and a girl from Manila. I listened to an episode, and the concept is they watch a movie and then they talk about the movie in the car after watching the movie. So really interesting, seems super smart. Like I said, you can probably find a podcast about just about anything. In fact, I'm tempted to open up a dictionary and like I'm gonna search on Google like Stones podcast. Let's see what comes up. Oh, well, this shouldn't have been surprising. It's the Rolling Stones. There's a Rolling Stones podcast. Like seriously, you can probably find a podcast just about anything. I was looking for like stones, like rocks, but anyway, there's podcasts from the Rolling Stones. Who knew? What about local podcasts? Like I mentioned, I was trying to research a little bit more about local podcasts. There aren't many. The most well-known local, when I say local, like Philippine podcast is probably Good Times with Mo from DJ Mo Twister, Magic 92.3, I believe. And but even that was like his last episode was like 2017, like a year ago, and he hasn't released any new ones. And then I also listened to his podcast a little bit. It was very much like his radio show. There were call-ins. They talk about love, life, and he'd have like famous guests, and they had like bits in their show. So it was very much in the same vein as a radio show. I mean, not really my cup of tea. Like I did listen to the Ellen Adarna one a few years ago. That was really interesting. She kind of just got drunk in the episode. Uh, but yeah, not many local podcasts. So it's one of the reasons why I wanted to start 032 Conversations. I there are people that I've interviewed in the podcast, and then they've been featured online, even on our site 032.com. But I always never got a sense that they were understood because once you talk to somebody and then you translate their words into text, sometimes you don't get the same tonation, you don't get the sense of what exactly they were talking about. So that's why I wanted to have 032 Conversations, and I thought it was important that a piece of our culture, the Cebu culture, oh sorry, the creative culture, particularly here in Cebu, would be represented somehow in the podcast world. So there's that. Yeah, so just a short mini episode about podcasts and podcasting. A few episodes that we have coming up, just to let you know. So next Tuesday, we're going to continue with our interview style episode. And coming up not in this order, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But we got Fonzie, interviewed him, talked about music and his creative process. France Deadways, talk about Deadways. Chad Manzo, talk about his like how his graphic work and how he got featured in High Snob and Hype Beast. And we talked to Katsky. How can you not have a podcast about creatives and not Talk to Katsky. So those are the episodes coming up. So stay tuned. I'd also like to know, how did you find this short mini episode? Is this something that I can put in between the interviews every now and then? Are there topics that you would want to hear about? Are there questions that you want answered? Let me know. Can send us a tweet, give out an email, even an Instagram DM. It's all happening in the DMs. Yeah, let me know how it goes. If you'd like, I can have future episodes where we answer questions about anything, about the creative process, about maybe you have questions for our guests. I'm open to all of those things. I just want to see what we can do with the podcast format. All right. So if this is your first time listening, subscribe to 032 Conversations. We're on iTunes. You can find us in any of the podcast apps that I mentioned in this episode. If you liked this episode, give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It helps us reach more people and in turn allows us to make more episodes. The music from this podcast is Piano March by Audionautics. All right. See you. I say all right a lot. I say and and all right. I gotta work on that. See you next Tuesday. Ciao.